I am Jeff Kantrowski. You've already heard my work credentials for the industry, but some other things I've been paid to do, sports writing, horse bodyguard, and professional wrestler. So my email address will be shared at the tail end. If you have any questions about those things, in addition to the content, we'll call that fair game too. So the title of my presentation is Call Me Jeff, and it does have a lot to do with person-centered language and really inclusivity and how really the English language ties into our behavior and how we translate that into the world. So we'll begin with that. I always like to lay out a few objectives or ground rules to set the stage, make sure I stick to that. So yes, we will have a little bit of vocabulary. There is no exam, obviously, in a Zoom format. One of the big ones I am huge on is the second bullet point, is that practice to be honest with ourselves. We're gonna have a couple of checkpoints for that. Part of that is gonna include tackling an ugly word or two, which was part of the promise in the presentation materials that were sent out. And then the exploration of language relating to inclusivity and a positive culture. So I do have one disclaimer for you, and I'm gonna share a couple different approaches surrounding that disclaimer. And the first is one of the things I often see in skip curriculums, which is those lists of activities to de-stress. I know at our agency, we have a list that has 101 items on it. And unfortunately, when you have such a large menu of options, when it comes time to use those, when it comes time to de-stress with that 101 items, you really don't have the time to take it out and really use that or utilize that or learn a new skill. I'm gonna contrast that to how this is gonna go today, and that is from my time in judo. So in judo, as opposed to a lot of other martial arts, you really focus on a much smaller subset of skills. So for 1 week, one of the things we did was we learned the 3 major throws, and almost all of judo is based off of those 3 original moves. And on day 1, you can learn all 3 of those. And then for the rest of the week, and sometimes for months afterwards, your goal is to find the one of those 3 that was most comfortable, and then practice that until you've achieved mastery. So that's really more of what we're gonna do today. So a good chunk of my time is gonna be spent trying to get buy-in to eventually have 1 or 2 tips or tricks. So unfortunately, if you're looking for a lot of how do I do this differently, you're not gonna find it. What you're gonna find is the reasons to do it, and hopefully that'll be just as helpful. Back in 2012, OPWDD really added some new things to our training regimen, and one of those was promoting positive relationships. For a lot of you, you may know that as praise, but back in 2012, it was not identified as such. So you may see a little bit of deviation, but this was our first go at one of the slides that dealt with person-first language. So you see these words, and then we talk about labeling, we talk about person-centered language, and it really didn't have a lot of guidance. So one of the things that this course or this topic today is really based off of is how I've evolved that over the years. So I've taken this one slide, which you can see is a little bit dated, and turned it into the rest of what you're gonna see today. When I teach this live, it's usually a little more interactive, but I start off by asking people to label the labels, and do we consider them to be negative or insulting or positive or neutral, or how do we feel about those and how do we see the world through those words? And they often end up getting grouped into different categories. And so that's what I've done today, since we don't have the ability to interact as well. So these 4, I call them the nouns. And these are the ones that people have on a gut level, really a deep understanding that these are things we shouldn't call somebody. So we may have some essential information. For instance, as a DSP or a frontline supervisor, you do need to be aware if there's a situation that you'll get bitten or get hit, or if you do need to handle, sometimes some incontinence, or if a person needs one-to-one supervision. So the information itself is not a problem, but the fact that these have been turned into nouns is really where the pitfall is. And again, I'm not going to spend time much on this slide because I think people intuitively get this one. This one gets a little bit trickier, and it's just another way to look at certain words or labels, and I call them the us versus thems. So low functioning and high functioning really don't have a purpose other than to label. And down at the bottom, I put their masquerading as diagnostic terms. And this is something that we're going to come back to later with a different term, but it's something I really want you to kind of focus on. As far as these 2 words in particular, they're not truly diagnostic. So unlike biting, hitting, or bedwetting, they're actually giving you less information. So because of that, it is a major pitfall, and really the only thing that is left for them to do is to put people in that box, which is unfortunate. And again, I'm gonna go through these slides pretty quickly because this is where it started, but definitely not where I wanna end up. And then this is gonna be another crux of today's presentation, that it depends. So our folks is one that I really get a lot of heated debate on when I bring up to people, because this one depends entirely on your definition of that one word our. A lot of people take offense to the word our because they see it as ownership. So we can't own people. They shouldn't be considered ours or our property. So a lot of people will label this one as kind of a negative term. But on the flip side, we do have people argue our includes me. So if you're including me in the group, then it cannot be perceived as an insult. And the tricky part of the English language is everybody's right, because ultimately it's not just the speaker that determines the meaning of the message. The listener plays just as important of a part. So this last word, this is really going to focus on a lot more of our conversation. And I call it the necessary evil. In that middle question, we got to call them something, don't we? It's something our field has circled back to countless times. And unfortunately, that bottom paragraph spells it out. We do need to accurately document who is providing supports and who is receiving supports. So that way, when we do have to provide information to our oversight entities, it's accurate and they know who is who. So that is unfortunately what I would call the necessary evil. So from there, here's a very brief history on it. In addition to the C word, consumer, we've used all those other words. In my time, which is about 14 years in the industry, I've already seen a few of these come and go. Individuals come around a couple times. Consumer is now no longer the word, rightfully so. But all these other ones have done the same, have had that same path. So the big question then is, how do these become insults? So here we are. I told you there wouldn't be a quiz. This is really more of that self-honesty check that I want you to be aware of. Without using the R word, and hopefully we don't see or use it anywhere today, I want you to take a minute and personally come up with what you think the definition is. Only rule that I have for you is that I do want you to be completely honest with yourself, and I'm not going to have anybody share that with you. So I'm going to start this clock here. I'm not probably going to mute it. Hopefully my slurping isn't too loud for that coffee break, but. And I will say silence is much easier when there's other faces in the room. Okay, so we see the clock is shaking. It's telling us our time is up. Hopefully you were honest with yourselves during that exercise. When I do this live, this is almost always what I get. People will give me some version of the word impaired. They'll say that it means that a person has some sort of learning disability. Most commonly, I will get a large segment of the room looking away uncomfortably because we know how toxic that term is and people don't really want to discuss it or describe it. And sometimes I'll get the and Jeff, I'm sure, kind of quiet mumble thing very frequently from that. The reason for that is because this is what most people are actually thinking. So when you ask a person for a definition or you're asking for something like this, what you're really doing is that word association game that we're all familiar with. So if I say the sky is, mentally you're going to fill that gap in with probably a color. You may put the word beautiful in. That word is going to be different for all of us, but it's going to be an instant reaction and it's going to be something that just happens. And when I use the R word, not even saying the full thing, often what people automatically have pop into their mind is one of these three things. And this is the time where you really want to be honest with yourself. If that slide asking you for your definition had one of those things pop into your head, that's understandable. And I'm not even going to say that they're really wrong. And that's another topic we're going to come back to. So here's the actual definition. This is going to be critical for a later point in the conversation. Right now, what you're looking at is a bell curve, which is usually used to set aside human distributions along a certain category. So this particular bell curve is for IQ tests. And at the bottom here, we have our perfect average. So that 100 is the perfect average score, but when we're talking social sciences, we really dislike perfect averages. We understand that people are going to deviate on one side or the other, and a certain amount of flexibility or wiggle room is important. So what we call that is a standard deviation, the normal amount that people deviate from the average. So plus or minus 1 is usually considered to be perfectly average as well. So rather than having 100 be that one singular perfect average, for the IQ test, between 85 and 115 points is all considered perfectly average. And what you see in the middle, the percentages, is the approximate percentage of a population that should be expected to fall within that range. So 68-ish amount of people should fall within perfectly normal testing scores for that test. Here we have between 1 and 2 standard deviations on either side. So that's between your 85 and your 70, and 115 and 130. So for these two sections, we understand there's probably something a little bit different among this group, but not so far that we have to make a clinical diagnosis about it. So this could be like, not necessarily a red flag, but maybe an orange flag to somebody providing supports or somebody interested in this particular demographic, but we're not actually attaching a diagnosis yet. So it's not until we get 2 standard deviations away where we determine that there is clinical significance. So the definition of the R word is 70. It's a numeric number attached to a score on an IQ test. And that's all it's ever meant to be. And this is going to come up later, so just keep this in mind. But for now, we're going to change the path just a little bit. Because we started with a presentation called Call Me Jeff, which has nothing to do with anything we've said so far. And as been pointed out several times already, that is literally my name. So why would that be the request? That bottom question on the slide, if you've been asking yourself that, I completely understand that. So here's the trick. It wasn't about me in the first place. My name came from our next door neighbor, who you see pictured on this slide with my oldest sister. I won't tell you the exact age, but if you ask her, it's 29. And as you see there, he is named Leonard. If you look towards the bottom of the article, the clipping that I show, you'll see that the name Jeff is in quotations. So I am named after this individual. My name is Jeff. However, it was not his. So similar to the R word, we took a word that had a perfectly appropriate meaning or perfectly well-defined meaning, in this case on his birth certificate, and it eventually developed into an insult. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't old enough before he passed to get the full story of why that became an insult. But that is what occurred to him. So rather than being called by his birth name, he chose a different identity. We're going to take another tangent, and if you know me, you know I like to do a bunch of them, but I promise we will end up on the path to answering some of the questions you may have from some of those past slides. To understand how some of these things happen, we need to understand how human behavior occurs and how we process information and get to that endpoint. So here we have a flow chart going from facts, which lead to values and beliefs, which lead to behavior. And really what that means is every time we take in a new piece of information, that's going to filter into our value systems, our belief systems, and our overall worldview. And our overall worldview is going to determine our behavior. So I have a bit of a fun example on the right-hand side. At some point in history, people started studying objects and sizes and shapes and all those things. So at the top of that column, you have basically just a sphere. That's all it is. So at some point, people started studying spheres, and they turned that information to other things. One interesting thing to know about spheres is if you have a steady light source, you can actually measure the distance around the sphere based on the shadows that you see from different points on that sphere or globe. So people use that information, those facts, and then they notice the shadows on the Earth were doing some of the same things. So if you put those two pieces of information, that's actually how people discovered that the Earth was round, was a lot of mathematical computations and other things that really led to that fact changing of value or belief. So down at the bottom, we have exactly who you think it is. That's Christopher Columbus. And one of the things that history often gets wrong in our books when we're taught is that it was controversial that the world was round during his time. And that's not true. It was actually widely accepted at the time that the Earth was round. One of the biggest questions, though, was just exactly how big is it and what happens if we go west? So putting all this together, over the course of history, we had a lot of facts that really led to this idea that the world is round. And that gave Christopher Columbus the bravery or the confidence to go around the world in what many considered to be the wrong direction. An interesting thing about this is it often works in reverse. So I have a mirror here, and the arrows are going the opposite direction now. We're going to practice this in just a second. But the idea for this slide is that sometimes we can recognize what a person's facts are just by hearing them speak. A lot of times when we have a gut reaction to something, we're going to express something verbally or behaviorally. And when we do that, we don't really have time to convince ourselves that we need to change that or do some monitoring of our behavior. So what comes from our gut often is a true indication or a mirror of our facts. So here's our example. I chose a cartoon because I didn't want to trigger any phobias, but this is something that really clearly illustrates what we're looking at here. The first thing we want to know for this examination is, what do you know about these things? What do you know about snakes? So the amount of facts you have and the level of expertise you have might actually change how you're thinking. So for instance, if I was an expert with snakes and I could positively identify just about every type in the world, what I think of those things or my beliefs towards those is going to be dependent almost entirely on what I know about that particular snake in front of me. Is it dangerous? Well, if I have good understanding, I can make that decision based on the facts. Or maybe I'll just consider it cute because I know this one's harmless and I can move beyond the idea of potential harm and move on to the fact of what does this particular one look like to me? If we take the idea of information away and really go with the idea of some snakes can be dangerous, that could also lead to that belief system that snakes are dangerous. So I'm not sure what type of snake this is could also lead to that same place. Those facts, again, will lead to those beliefs, and then it will lead to action. So scared is a belief system or part of that value set, and it will lead to you running away, or, you know, the opposite of flight is fight. So will you attack it? Will you try to remove that threat through aggressive action? If you do have a good fact set, or maybe you just don't feel that there's need for danger, that could lead to the belief set of maybe curiosity. So you could run towards it or pick it up even. Going back to the mirror concept from the previous slide, what was the first thing that would come out of your mouth in this situation? Is it an O expletive? I promise not to swear for this one. But if the first thing that comes out of your mouth is a holy bleep, maybe you're showing that maybe you're scared of this. So it is going back to that facts or belief system. And that last question is important. So are your beliefs supported by your facts? In almost all cases, they will be. So we're going to attach some of this to the R word, really get to the idea of how it became an insult. And there's a few concepts here just to be aware of. I said earlier that high functioning and low functioning were masquerading as diagnostic terms. And most of the definitions that we've been given for the R word over our lifetime have been similar masquerade terms, or shortcut languages, I'd call them. So when you've asked somebody, you know, what does this mean? Very few people have probably taken the time out of their day to give you a slideshow presentation on IQ tests, standard deviations, and overall statistics. It's just not something that's in most of our interest. So we don't take the time to do it. So instead we come up with shorter versions to say that. And unfortunately, they lose a lot of the meaning. So that's one of the few major issues that really lead to this becoming an insult. When this is repeated enough, it becomes the overarching message. When I teach this live, I will very occasionally get somebody who can give me that the answer is Yosemite when I ask them what the definition is. Most often people are giving me one of those other shortcut definitions. And the reason that's happening is because the repetition has led to internalization. If you hear the word enough times, that does become the meaning. So I'm going to give you a story that probably applies to all of us in some way. It's actually going to be a two-part story. And I want you to have this slide in front of you as I tell the story, because this applies to all of the words we've used over the years, whether it's consumer, individual, client, doesn't matter. All of them have had a similar path. So we're going to make up a couple names just on the spot here. So let's go with Billy and Susie. So Billy and Susie have grown up for the first few years of their life, maybe as next door neighbors. They've interacted, they've had play dates, they've had a lot of fun together. They know each other very well. And then they get to the school system where they've been given that IQ test. And unfortunately for Susie, she's been diagnosed with the dreaded R word. So she scored that 70 or below. Now what that meant for most people, and still does mean, unfortunately to some degree, is that this person then becomes isolated. And they're pulled away from the classroom, which Billy, having been good friends with Susie, immediately recognizes that his friend is no longer in the classroom with him. So the first thing that Billy might be inclined to do is say, well, where's Susie? And so he's probably going to be given an answer that she's pulled away to a different class. And of course, childhood curiosity leads to the next question. Well, why? And at that point, the adult in Billy's life has to give him a reason. And that reason is the definition of the R word that he will probably take with him for the rest of his life. So it could be that he's been given the message that she is slower than him, that she doesn't test as well, that maybe she's not as prepared for school, maybe she has a disability, or maybe it's some uglier language that has been used in the past that I don't think I need to repeat, but I think we all know or aware of. And when Billy gets home and asks his parents the same thing, they're probably not going to be prepared with any better language of where Susie went. And every adult in Billy's life is probably going to give him a very similar story. And so in reality, all of us probably have a similar story that happened to us. For instance, in my life, I'm about the same age as one of our board members' daughters, and we live maybe a quarter of a mile away from each other. And in a small town, that usually means you know somebody pretty well. But I count the number of times I interacted with her throughout my lifetime on one hand and still have enough fingers to hold a cup of coffee. And I never remember getting a good answer on where she was or what the reasoning was. It was just, she's in a different place and we don't necessarily need to talk about it. And unfortunately, what that messaging means is less than normal. And that's what always happens. So coming back to our mirror concept, if that's the only message you get, that will eventually be internalized. And the message of slower, this message of less than, which all these terms eventually do come back to, that will become internalized. And that is unfortunately what often leads to bullying or ill treatment of persons with disabilities, or really any insulting language. It's that repetition, that shortcut language, and all of that internalization coming together in one ugly force. Because we do have a few different branches here, let's go back to our Leonard branch. I said earlier that I never really got the full story of how Leonard became an insult, but here's a few ideas on how it may have happened. So we're going to start off by saying just a few things about Leonard versus Jeff. So Leonard could be shortened to Leo, Leon, Lenny, maybe the nickname Lion. The actual meaning is brave as a lion, and it is a word of English origin. Jeffy often comes up. Sometimes people use my full name. It is actual meaning is God peace or God's peace. It is often attributed to English origin. However, earlier than that, it is probably derived from Germanic. So we tend to think of things often as how we view them in our particular meaning, but even just with two proper nouns, what we're looking at is multiple meanings for all of those. And any single one of those could be a problem. So coincidentally, Mel, who you'll be having the pleasure of listening to in just a little bit, and I were having a conversation prior to the conference starting today. And she mentioned somebody she knew who goes by his middle name. And the reason he goes by his middle name is because he doesn't like who he's named after. So his first name is somebody he doesn't like. And so that is a reason for him to distance himself from that. So it's possible that Leonard Lounsbury, the person I'm named after, didn't like who he was named after. So that's one possibility. Maybe he didn't like the sound of Leo. Maybe he didn't like the sound of Lenny. Maybe he didn't feel brave as a lion. Maybe he didn't feel connected to that. And then you have to ask yourself, why did he choose Jeff? Is it just something you like the sound of? That's okay. What if he liked the idea of God peace or God's peace? What if he had some Germanic origin to his ancestry and he wanted to honor with that? So all of those could be a potential reason to identify as something slightly different than what he was born as. And so we're ready for another tangent, and we're getting pretty close to what we can do as far as tips go. The first thing to be aware of is that English is an incredibly diverse language, primarily because it is built from so many. At the origin of human language, you had to start somewhere, and you kind of derived into multiple paths. And English is one of those paths that occurred so late in the game that we really pulled from everywhere else. So this slide is pretty self-explanatory. Each of these languages has a few examples of words that were pulled from it that we think of as English, but really they derive from some other language. So the word autumn, for instance, comes from French. Embargo comes from Spanish. Sabbatical is definitely deeply rooted in Hebrew. And on top of that, every year we add more. When I grew up, we were told in no uncertain terms that ain't is not a word. Well, guess what? Now it's in most dictionaries. Blog, finna, words we never would have thought of are appearing in our life, and we're getting used to those pretty much on a daily basis. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this slide because I really think it's important for people to understand that when you use any word in the English language, that there is a very deep story attached to every single one of those words. And you can't think of language as just one singular item because it goes so deep and so complex that to the listener, it could mean something completely different. So we're going to start with the days of the week and how they came to get their names. In order to do that, the first thing I'm going to remove is the very easy part of the origin, the word day. So now that we've removed that, the first one is probably going to become very clear. So the origin of the word Sunday does come from the celestial body, the sun. And if you're good at adding a letter or two, you're probably already ahead of me, and you're already knowing what Monday is based off of. So yes, Monday is based off of Moon Day. So our first two names of the days of the week are based off of celestial bodies. This is where things are going to get a little tricky. I'm going to spend a lot of time on Tuesday. Tuesday is one of my favorite ones, and I think it really encapsulates exactly how deep these names go. What you hopefully can see on your screens is a picture of what looks like a man with his hand in a wolf's mouth. And yes, we're still talking about Tuesday. So I'm going to tell you a story about the Fenris wolf, which is an ancient iconic figure in Viking mythology. So the Fenris wolf was born of the gods and was prophesied to be able to grow big enough and strong enough to not only take on the gods, but kill them. As you can imagine, the gods were not super happy about that. So as they saw this wolf grow and become a bigger and bigger threat, they decided to come up with a plan of action to try and capture it so it couldn't do any harm. So the first thing they did is they built this really strong chain of iron. And as every character does, every great character has, there was a fatal flaw for the Fenris wolf, or Fenrir as he's called, and his was pride. So they approached the Fenris wolf and they said, you want to become the biggest and the strongest. And in order to prove that and show your fame, we want to see if you can break this chain. So the Fenris wolf allowed himself to be bound with the first chain. And he took one big kick, just one, and he shattered their chain to bits. And so of course the god said, well, crap, that didn't work. So they built a bigger and stronger chain. And the wolf, having grown even bigger and stronger himself, fell for the same trick. They said, if you really want to show how big and strong you are and be famous throughout the world, you'll be able to break this chain. So he allowed himself to be bound one more time. And after a little bit of struggle, because they did a really good job with that chain, he shattered that one as well. And so the gods were kind of in a corner at that point. So they went down to the dwarves, and when they got there, they said, we need something a little bit better for this wolf. So they came up with 7 impossible materials. So the one that's my favorite is they went out and got the footfalls of a cat. So that was one of the things made to make the next chain. But the next chain wasn't actually a chain. It was a thin ribbon, which of course, because it came from the gods, you have to assume was magical. And Fenris, even though he was prideful, also wasn't, slow enough to fall for this trick. So when they came to him and said, you can prove your fame by breaking this, his reaction was, what fame is there to gain by breaking a ribbon? I've already broken your strongest chain. What challenge is there in a ribbon? So he said, I think you're up to something. I'll do it, but one of you, for a show of good faith, has to put your hand in my mouth while I'm bound. And that's where we get the name Tuesday, because the only person brave enough to do that was the god Tyr, who became known among the Vikings as the god of bravery for his willingness to sacrifice his right hand, which in most cases would be your fighting hand, the one you use for most things, and very important to really anybody, let alone a god. And he's the one who did that. So over the years, rather than Thursday, it became changed to Tuesday. And if you're wondering, the answer is yes, the ribbon held, and unfortunately, Tyr did lose his hand. We'll go through the other ones a little quicker, because they all have a very similarly rich story. So if you're really into some of that lore and mythology, you may know that at one point, Odin went by the name Woden. So another Viking god, we have Woden's Day for Wednesday. And he had a son you may be familiar with. I'm using the MCU pictures. So Thursday is named after his son Thor. And to complete the family a little bit, Friday is named after his mother and Odin's wife, Frigga. We're going to change gears just a little bit again, because Saturn is, of course, named after a line of cars that came out in the last millennium. Hopefully you're laughing. That's not true at all. Saturday is named after Saturn, the Roman god. So just in the days of the week, something all of us probably have taken for granted at some point in our life, we have 3 different kind of pantheons of gods or mythology tied into just 3 different days. So everything that comes out of your mouth, every word that we've ever used in our lifetime probably has a very rich and deep history attached to it, which is very important to note. Because again, if you say something like Tuesday to me, I'm going to take it a little bit differently than most people will, because I'm going to start thinking about wolves and missing hands. So here's where we actually get to the tips. And these are nothing that's going to be shocking. Really, the idea here is that the buy-in, the reasons behind these are why we want to do these skills. So when I say creativity, those last 2 slides are really where to drive that point home. There's never been a time in my life where there hasn't been a different way to say things. The richness of the English language is just amazing. And our ability to modify or change what we say or how we say it is almost limitless. So if we find that language is limiting our interactions with a person or challenging our ability to do that, we can always alter that. So asking questions. So going back to our fault, one of the things I always tell people is, if somebody tells you I'm offended by that, your first response should be, well, what would you prefer instead? It's as easy as that. And getting to know somebody. So what is their standards? How do they interact with the world? How do they see things? Will help you with that. So here's another honesty point. So we're going back to Leonard. Back in the mid 1900s, when Leonard was insisting on being called Jeff, it was really not a big deal. But what if he'd asked to be called Teresa? Now I look around the room when I do this. I don't have the ability to do that today. But when I look around the room, I can see a few people have a reaction because this does challenge your social norms. The takeaway then is we do have to understand how we react to people's language and requests so that we can go beyond that. Because I think it's natural for a lot of us to say, well, Teresa is a little bit different than being asked to call Jeff. And that's how we feel about it, and that's okay. But the takeaway for me is, well, Leonard is not Leonard. He's going to be Jeff or he's going to be Teresa, depending on what he insists on. And if you insist on Leonard, the only thing you do is damage that relationship. So I'm going to come back to this slide. This is one of my biggest tips. It's one of the things I've been harping on for one of the longest times, especially for our industry, because as I noted in the one slide, we've used so many of these necessary evil terms, whether it's consumer or individual or resident, and they've all eventually turned into that meaning of less than normal, and they've all eventually turned into an insult. And we always justify a new one. So individual is the current term that we're using in industry, but I expect in the next few years, we're going to start changing that again. And it all comes back to that we got to call them something, don't we, question. And my answer is no, we don't. There's always two sides to the coin when we start labeling things. So I'm going to give you a brief example of a service note. I'm going to use myself as an example, and we'll go with Bob. I'm providing supports to Bob. If I were to just write the note, Jeff asked Bob to do his laundry, that's too vague for an auditor because either one of us could be either party. Bob could have a laundry goal, so he's the person receiving supports, and I could be asking him to work on a goal, or I could be the one receiving supports, and I could be asking Bob to do laundry for me. So either one of those things is possible. So the way we've always done that, and the way we've been doing this in that cycle that I keep talking about, is we always say something like, Jeff asked consumer Bob, or Bob the consumer, to do his laundry. So now we know who is who. Alternatively though, if we were to say Jeff, quality improvement coordinator, asked Bob to do his laundry, we know who is who. And the beauty of that solution is that we're always using a positive label. We're using something we should take pride in. And I don't know any way to say this other than very bluntly, but if you're not proud of your job title in this industry, you should probably find another career because none of us are going to get rich quick on this one. So you probably should be doing it for other reasons. And that's what most of us stick around for. That's why I've been in the industry for 14 years. So because of that, every title I've ever had, I've been proud of. And that distinction is very clear in our documentation, but it also adds some pride to it and it adds a positive spin to that. So here's my conclusion. The goal of language is to get a point across. It doesn't really matter how. And it's never worth upsetting somebody. So if you do so, there's an easy way to fix that. And that's to be creative and ask those questions and to say to yourself, well, what was upsetting to that person? What part of the message did I put out there was upsetting and how can I change that? Because there's always another path. And that's me in different times. My email address, if you need that. I'm gonna leave that up for just another 10, 15 seconds and then we are all set.